everyone. I'm Emily and I'm a third year student now at Sussex studying English. And I'm today going to be talking to you about An Inspector Calls. I really enjoyed this play when I studied it myself at GCSE, and I think it says a lot about different themes of class differences, the idea of responsibility and age and generational changes, which I'm sure you've discussed in your classes. But today I'd like to focus on the idea of screen representations, the idea of scene descriptions and stage directions. Now we don't have a lot of time to talk about this, so I'm going to be quite brief in what I give you, but hopefully it will give you a starting point to look at the things that aren't necessarily there as speech within reading the text. And it's something that we see a lot more visually as a play. When we watch a play, you might have seen adaptations of it during your classes or outside. But it's something that we might be tending to ignore when we actually read it because it's not something that's said. So what makes screen descriptions and scene descriptions important? It's kind of like an instruction manual for the director, which is why we see play adaptations in very different ways. Each director might interpret those scene descriptions very differently, just like you might have very different opinions on what a certain speech might indicate compared to your friend. And that's what makes literature really exciting, because we're constantly debating about what meanings might be about the words that we read and how we take it. So what's really interesting is to kind of look at how these different characters and scenes are portrayed by the different adaptations and what that might mean for how you read the play. For example, I was drawn to the red walls in the first image that immediately brought back memories for me of the famous Fire, Blood and Anguish monologue that the inspector leaves at the end. I must stress that isn't a direct comparison. That's not something that can be proven. And it isn't necessarily what the scene might be about, but the colours, lighting, positioning, they can all help you to build a tone and kind of draw upon the meanings that we might think to be really noticeable. For example, looking at the different dining rooms might show something about what kind of things are different and what things are the same. And if all of them indicate the same kind of similarities, maybe that's a really important part that the play is getting at, that everybody has picked up on. For example, the pictures and things that we'll look at later on, they all kind of are shown in these pictures, right? It's something that is obviously seen to be quite prominent. But why is it prominent? What does it say about the characters in the scenes? So the black and white picture down at the bottom here, this is from a 1948 production of the play, and Edna, the maid here, is situated at the back of the stage, but it's still quite present in the scene, something that we don't see in these other pictures, for example. And I think this kind of says something about class issues throughout the text as well. And you'll notice in some of the I keep saying screen, but in some of the scene descriptions and the script notations and scene directions, you'll see different parts about Edna that aren't really prominent, and she kind of plays a background role. And I think that's really important when looking at class, that she's a character that isn't brought to the forefront and she kind of lingers in the back, but she is present, and that says a lot about what you could look at class descriptions within the household. So this is a plan of the this is a scene plan from the play, from a script, and it details the positioning and the changing positions of the different objects within the scene. And this is obviously a plan view, so we're looking directly down onto it. But you can see that the table's positioning moves from the first act to the second act, and it stays in the dotted lines for the third as well. So in the first act, as it says at the bottom of in the description at the bottom, the solidly drawn diagram shows the table for Act 1 only. So in the first act, presumably, as this highlights, because there's a good deal of business at the table during that act, it's positioned so that the audience are able to see quite central the characters, both at their head of the table here and around the side as well. But when this shifts, we see this head of the table move further back into the scene, and the characters on this side, presumably Sheila and Gerald, moving towards the back as well. So what might that say, for example? As highlighted in the description, it does move, And with the later acts, the table is skewed so that the person here is further away from us. But why might that be? So remember, in the first act, as the description say, there is a good deal of business at the table. And then as things become to get more confrontational, especially when Sheila and Gerald have their little bit of an upset too, they kind of move further back. And Mr. Berlin is the first to be questioned, isn't he? So assuming that he's at this head of the table, where's the mouse? At this head of the table, he's kind of moved back into the background to allow focus on the other characters. So it could be about a shift in focus to allow the audience to focus on different characters, as you would get if you were reading a novel. You'd read descriptive paragraphs that would emphasize one character or one scene, maybe a different room more than others, right? So the significance of using the dining table can also be something that's quite interesting, especially if you're looking at terms of class, because situating this event in the dining room rather than as a summer's picnic or as the inspector, if the inspector was visiting individual rooms as he's going around the house, it might say something about the idea of all the family members being together to create kind of a tense environment, and the idea, again, as we said about Edna the maid, the idea that this is a very aristocratic environment. It's not something that is usually shown to be quite a homely environment, as we'll look at later. Also looks at kind of the class differences in the kind of life experience that someone of this class might have compared to a different class. This is the biggest scene description within the play because it's the first one, it's the first kind of real insight we get into the characters and this scene that's depicted. So this is a really interesting one, especially comparing it to a novel where you'd have a look at descriptions, particularly of Dickens, I'm thinking, where, say in A Christmas Carol, there's a lot of description around the place and the housing. So this is kind of like that. This is kind of the bit where you start to imagine, if you're not seeing it as an adaptation, if you're reading it only, it's the part where you get to imagine the scene. And this is obviously really useful for directors because they're able to kind of position their staging in a way that evokes the main intentions of what J.B. Priestley wanted in the first place. So this is a scene description from the first act of Inspector Calls, and its purpose is kind of just to describe what the room's like and very briefly give a description of the characters as well, as we see over on this side here, and we'll come to in a bit. But as well as this, it does have a lot of room for interpretation, which is really good for your close reading side of things. And it means that it can be a really useful provider of evidence if you're looking at providing quotations for, say, a character's insights, or maybe looking at the idea of staging or the idea of scene and tone within the play. So we'll go through a few things now that you might pick out. It's things that I've seen, but obviously you are more than welcome to have a look for yourself, and there's no right or wrong in English, which is what I really love about it. So actually you could pick up some very different things to me and argue in a very different way, and you'd still be really credible, because that's the important part of English, is kind of choosing bits that you can make a credible argument about. But as long as you make a credible argument and you substantiate it, you're doing great. So the first one I've picked out is a quote right at the start, and it says, fairly prosperous manufacturer. That's kind of relating to the kind of people that live in the house without us knowing who the characters are. And I thought that would be quite good at linking to the idea of class, and talking about how Mr. Berlin owns a company. So he's not the typical kind of working class worker, the kind of person who is employed but employs other people. Right, so he's got, or immediately you think of this family as having a certain standing in the area. So he is making money and making more money rather than losing money, which is kind of indicated by the idea of being fairly prosperous. So he's not doing too badly. So we will look into how this plays out later, but what might it say about the family's standing and their attitudes towards lower classes, for example? The idea that he's a fairly prosperous manufacturer and it's a fairly large suburban house. The idea of fairly kind of plays in with me, that they're on a middle ground kind of thing. They're not to a point where they can waste money senselessly, but they're also not in a point where they wouldn't be classed as in kind of an impoverished state, and they certainly won't be going without. So it gives you a bit of an idea around their class status. So the next one is relating again to the household environment, and it's a few imposing but tasteless pictures that are hung on the wall. And to me, that kind of seems like a really small addition. But if you look at the images that I showed you right at the start, these ones, they're all there. As I said before, we've got pictures, I'm trying to point to the screen here, but you won't be able to see that. We've got pictures up here. We've got pictures down here in the 1948 edition. You can't really see in this one, but I think there's a couple towards the back, but it's quite dark. And we've got pictures up on the wall here. Now, they're not really what I'd consider to be family environment pictures, which also links back to the quote of not cozy and home-like, which I'll talk about in a minute. It might insinuate by being tasteless that it has no kind of emotional value to the family, and maybe they're just there for impression, which link into the time that this is set. Remember, it's set in the 1910s, 1912, just before the First World War, but it's also written in 1944. So you've got that element of looking back. So J.B. Priestley is writing this in 1944, looking back at the time, which gives you a lot more of a retrospective, especially with the irony when he talks about the Titanic, and the idea of being wrong with Mr. Berlin. So the idea that these are of a class status, the idea that these paintings and these portraits are showing the audience their type of family, not what the family actually reflects, is quite a particular idea. And you can look out for this particularly in how Mr. Berlin first greets the inspector, the idea that he offers him port and he mentions the people he knows that are in high places. It's very much presenting an idea of what they want to be appearing to be, rather than maybe presenting family portraits and making it a cozy home-like environment. It's a very kind of disjointed, non-emotional area, which particularly in the dining room is shown a lot because it's quite a rigid and formal environment. They're all dressed up. The portraits are quite formal, and it just kind of gives an extra detail of showing what their class status is like and how that projects onto them rather than the other way around. So the not cozy and home-like quote, often I often think of it as being something that is it says a lot about the characters as well. The idea, later on we'll look at Mrs. Berlin being quite a cold character as well, particularly. These pictures on the wall are very similar to that in that they don't reflect that idea of very comforting style. If you look at the lighting and things as well in these pictures, it's all quite dark. There isn't really a lot of a fun vibe. There isn't really that homely kind of comfort and relaxation. It's all very formal. So yeah, this scene ultimately represents a family that's kind of impersonal towards each other. I don't think they'd really, well, they obviously don't, especially with Eric, know what's going on in each other's lives, which is why the investigation prompted by the inspector takes such a dramatic turn, because people, they don't know what they're all getting up to. Everyone's got these secrets. So my biggest question here is, do they seem like a family of sympathy for one another and for wider attitudes? Do they seem like a family that would be considerably understanding? Or do they seem like a family that would be quite closed off and quite cold in how they'd approach things and not very tolerable? So obviously these are quite deep analysis, and I wouldn't want you to kind of take my word for all of this, but it's prompting you to think about how small details can have a much wider impact on the attitudes of the people, and when you're looking at describing these things later on in essays. So now we get to the positioning of the people. This is quite important for setting up a scene, and it can be commented on for what it says about the individual people and who's in focus in the scene, who's not, as we talked about with the table moving positions. So this quote describes Arthur Berlin at one end of the table and his wife at the other. So the younger generation are kind of sandwiched between these two figures of the family. The older Berlins are sort of seen as the protectors in this scene because they're at the ends, they're kind of holding the whole scene together, if you like, because they're at the two ends, they're kind of sandwiching everyone between. The older Berlins are almost guarding the dining table, and it might be shown to represent that social class standing of the family, that the dining room is often where the social events of higher class circles take place. So Sheila, Eric and Gerald are all forced into the middle and have the older opinions of Mr. and Mrs. Berlin kind of thrust upon them, quite literally at times, because they've got these, ultimately they have the most concrete opinions on things. So when they're at the ends of the table, it kind of figuratively shows how there is very little chance of escape for these younger generations when they've got these kind of ideas forced upon them. So my next quote relates to the characters. We start looking at the characters from this point on. It might be an extension task for you to look at how the champagne bottles and port glasses are kind of represented. And there is a little bit about Edna here. I just have really run out of time to talk about things. So this description relates to the character of Arthur Berlin. He's seen as kind of the patriarchal figure here. Arthur is described as heavy looking and rather pretentious. And that might relate to a link with arrogance, especially as you see later on with his speeches about different things. I'm thinking particularly the Titanic as well. His heavy appearance is one maybe of too much confidence, and one that he's a person that very few people argue with, which might say something about how his manners and his volume of voice has kind of got to be, because do people bother arguing with him? If they don't, he's going to continue, isn't he? So it might say something about how he entreats other people. For example, the people who work for him, like Edna and his other employees, as we find out with the treatment of Eva/Daisy. And this small description might allow us to think more about not only what his character might be in like general, but what relation he might play to looking at the themes of class and responsibility. If he's seen as the top figure in the family, what might that say about the other people in relation to him? I've also picked up on how he looks with his easy manners but provincial speech. So in other words, he's got quite a narrow-minded approach, and this might reinforce ideas about the heavy-looking aspect of things, where he's quite difficult to argue with, and that might mean that his kind of negotiations, as we find out later on, his negotiations are non-existent with the people he deems to be below him. So the next part is about Mrs. Berlin. There's not as much mentioned about Mrs. Berlin, but what is mentioned is super important, because they don't mention her by name, which is very interesting. There isn't any kind of, as you see in the caps here, Arthur Berlin is the first name. Even Sheila and Gerald and Eric all have their names stated. Mrs. Berlin does not. She's just related to as his wife. So that's interesting when we look at the gender structures and the process of marriage within this text, and what that might say for Arthur Berlin's social status and his social mobility, because remember, he is traditionally of a lower class than Mrs. Berlin, and she is considered, as I've quoted here, her husband's social superior. So she's the one who has had the aristocratic heritage, and that's been transferred to Arthur through marriage, which is quite interesting when you look at the idea of the wife having the superior role and what that's meant for Arthur Berlin. So as a cold woman, Mrs. Berlin might challenge these ideas that we have about women and mothering, especially at that time, and the idea of living in a non-cozy house. Maybe that might say something about what she represents in terms of aristocracy and the idea of living in a higher class society as a woman, especially when Arthur Berlin appears to kind of take over that role as the social superior, even when he actually isn't. So The next one is about Sheila. I think she's probably my favourite because she changes so much. Sheila is regarded to be in her early 20s, very pleased with life and rather excited. So the idea of her youth really highlights a naivety and a lack of experience in the world. As someone who grew up privileged, she is someone who lacks the kind of real world experience, that she's not really dealt with much hardship. And we definitely see that in how she's really excited about her life. She is likened to a naive child, especially at the start when she calls her mum mummy. And she's just wrapped up in this bubble of shopping and engagement, the typical kind of princess life you might liken it to, but of the 1910s. So one revision idea I thought of might be an idea to highlight the quotes that highlight Sheila right at the start in Act 1, and how she's kind of living in happy-go-lucky land, and then how by Act 3 she's really taken on a grasp of responsibility. I think Sheila is one of those that represents what J.B. Priestley hopes for the younger generation by admitting mistakes and accepting responsibility, being a bit more compassionate, and what he hopes for the future. So I think Sheila's a really good example of how responsibility can take over, and the representation of the younger generation within this text. But on the other hand, we also have Gerald. Now, Gerald is, as I'm sure you know, Sheila's fiance, considered too manly to be dandy, meaning he's deemed to be masculine. He's deemed to be too masculine to be a man who puts huge importance into physical appearance and leisurely activity. So thinking about how that might contribute to his role in gender within the book, within the play, might be something to think about. And it's something that isn't kind of drawn upon a lot, I don't think. So in particular, think about how the scenes play out between Sheila and Gerald's conflict when we learn about Daisy, and how that might play, and the inequalities of gender there too, and how Sheila kind of reacts to this. So being a well-bred young man, Gerald represents the new generation of the elite class. So very much like Sheila is presented as this class for change, generation for change within class. Gerald is very much the same, but I think J.B. Priestley presents him in a way of wanting to warn against what could happen. So Sheila offers an insight to an optimistic light of generational change, because Sheila then goes on to kind of accept responsibility. But right to the end, Gerald has this sense of entitlement where he's saying, well, the inspector wasn't really real, and this doesn't really come as a reliable character. So therefore, all of the things that were noted about responsibility don't matter in this instance, so don't matter ever. And I think Gerald is kind of contrasted with Sheila to represent what could happen if we ignore it, and the attitudes that could be shown still. So Eric is our final one. He is considered a half shy, half assertive man. And I think this is quite a good quote to remember when you talk about him, because it kind of conflicts the shyness and his assertiveness. It highlights his confusion as a young person growing up. He is sometimes one thing and sometimes another. But what does that say about the process of growing up, and especially in a place that would be considered an impersonal environment? It's not your typical family lifestyle. So he's an embodiment of responsibility from the start, because he's drinking a lot, he has a reckless encounter with Daisy, and he fails to acknowledge his role, both in the family and within his wider society. But by the end, just like Sheila, that half-shy character becomes the half-assertive one, and he takes responsibility for his actions. So I think this is also a really important one to think about, the idea of mistakes and the idea of learning. The fact that Eric grows up in this environment where he doesn't have to take responsibility. So he kind of falls into that trap of not taking responsibility. He doesn't consider it an option. And then as things come to light with the inspector, just as Sheila does, he realizes that actually there is time to change, and change would be good. So that's a way that he changes to highlight the best of him. He's clearly got it there because he's already half assertive. But Eric is used to kind of show that that's the bit that you want to propagate. That's the part of you that you want to grow, rather than the shy, inconsiderate nature that Gerald arguably has a little bit of, in that he doesn't consider anybody. But Eric kind of does it in a more mellow way because he's shy and he doesn't really confront a lot, and that was his downfall. Whereas Gerald kind of confronts too much and thinks that he's right all the time. So I think Priestley kind of argues that there needs to be a balance. You need to accept responsibility, but stand up for what you believe in, which is exactly what Sheila and Eric do against their parents. So the last quote I have is right at the end, and it's about a special occasion and are pleased with themselves. So that's more of a description again of the opening scene that we see right at the start, and it kind of gives a note of what we expect to see when those curtains open and the play begins. So this part is obviously about the engagement, this special occasion. A union of elite and respectable families is considered a great success, not just for the happy couple, but more as a business transaction between the families, which is probably why they're all looking pleased with themselves rather than just the couple. In terms of gender, I think this says a lot about marriage and the idea of happiness relating to the parents and the wider family, instead of just to the individuals. And I think that also relates when we're looking at Arthur Berlin at one end of the table and his wife at the other, the idea that their situation within this plays an important part, and it's not just about the individual acts of the younger generation. So I think contextually, the role of women in the 1910s when this was set, marriage was the target, and the higher class business establishment like Gerald's would have welcomed the news. So it was kind of a win-win situation for everybody, until obviously the inspector comes in and kind of upstages things and dismantles it a little bit, which says a lot about the idea of security as well within marriage, within business at the time, and kind of preempts, especially because J.B. Priestley is writing retrospectively, it might preempt the uncertainty of the World War I situation as well, because it's only a few years after this is set that kind of takes hold and shakes up the country itself. So whilst the house might not be cosy and our characters might be ones of provincial speech, cold and half shy, the occasion is one of good news and therefore is more likely to start as a light-hearted event rather than one of panic and trauma. And I think that's quite an important thing to remember because it allows a direct contrast. When the inspector arrives, there's that air of suspicion, the idea of an investigation, the idea of finding out secrets, and that all raises in the audience a kind of erring on the side of caution of how this family appear and what their reality is like. So I think that's a really important part to look at in what Priestley's intentions are. We don't start straight away with the inspector. Why does he want us to see the family looking happy just beforehand? Okay, well, thank you so much for listening. I hope this has been useful to you. And I have a bit of a conclusion here just to round things up. So the scene descriptions and stage directions, I got it right, can be useful to looking at what the characters are like and what the scenes depict, just as much as the speech. And I'd really encourage you to have a look at adaptations that have been approved by your teachers to kind of situate that vibe of what the directors are taking from the scripts themselves, and maybe use that to think about your own interpretations. So think about where things are said, what the room is like, where the character is on the stage, and what does that have to say about the themes you're exploring. This is a really useful way for kind of getting extra information that other people might not have been thinking about, because people tend to ignore the stage directions. So it might be a way of adding that little quote or that little insight that the examiner thinks they've really thought about this, which is obviously going to up your marks. So stage directions throughout the text are really important as well, because they give guidance for the actors and therefore the readers of the script on how to act, and how things might be said. So it might be that they're in a tense position or they say it quite relaxed, and what influence that might have on what they say next. They're really useful to analyze if you prefer dealing with chunkier paragraphs of text, just like that first one we saw. So it might be, if you're struggling with the idea of a play and small snippets of speech, it might be something that you look at if you quite like close reading, longer prose text, like in a novel. And it might be useful for you to look at how the descriptions are being interpreted by different people, so that, like I said before, you can think about what's similar and what is different in these adaptations and what is considered most important for the directors to draw upon, what that might give for a stronger argument, or the things that are done very differently and you think, oh, I like that, that's a unique interpretation, I can use that to kind of think about my own insights. So once again, thank you so much for listening, and I hope this has been useful to you. As ever, if you want to contact Sussex Writes for more information or for more guidance on these kind of things, please do, and hopefully I'll see you guys soon. Thanks.